The ATF just got hit with the political equivalent of a tactical nuke, and they're absolutely panicking behind closed doors. Trump's latest bill contains language so devastating to federal gun control that anti-Second Amendment politicians are having complete meltdowns trying to kill it before anyone notices what's inside. This isn't some minor policy tweak. We're talking about statutory text that could literally shut down entire ATF departments overnight and restore constitutional rights that have been trampled for nearly a century. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what I'm about to show you will blow your mind about how close we are to constitutional victory. The ATF's worst nightmare revealed. Buried deep inside Trump's budget proposal sits the most lethal weapon ever aimed at ATF tyranny. Specific language that systematically strips the agency of its most oppressive powers. This provision doesn't just limit the ATF, it obliterates their authority to regulate entire categories of firearms and constitutional rights. If this text survives the political warfare ahead, every unconstitutional tax stamp disappears, every months-long approval process vanishes, and every federal database tracking law-abiding gun owners gets deleted from existence. Constitutional lawyers are calling this the most significant rollback of federal gun control since the Second Amendment was ratified. The ATF brass knows their regulatory empire is about to crumble, which explains why they're desperately lobbying Congress to kill this provision before it becomes law. The language is so carefully crafted that it could slip through budget reconciliation with just 51 Senate votes, bypassing usual filibuster tactics. How the ATF built their tyrannical empire. The ATF's assault on constitutional rights began in the 1930s, when anti-gun politicians couldn't get enough votes for outright confiscation, so they weaponized taxation and bureaucracy instead. They created fees that cost more than new cars just to exercise constitutional rights, turning the Second Amendment into a privilege for the wealthy elite. Over decades, the ATF expanded this tyrannical system, building a regulatory maze designed to trap law-abiding Americans in endless paperwork, while criminals ignore every single rule. Federal agents transformed from crime fighters into constitutional rights violators, creating arbitrary approval processes that treat citizens like subjects begging for government permission. What started as Depression-era panic legislation became a permanent bureaucratic empire that violates constitutional principles daily. The ATF created classification systems so complex that even federal judges struggle to understand them, leading to contradictory rulings and arbitrary enforcement. They invented regulatory categories that exist nowhere in actual law, then prosecuted Americans for violating rules that change based on bureaucratic interpretation rather than legislative intent. The agency weaponized technical specifications to criminalize common modifications and accessories, turning millions of law-abiding gun owners into potential felons overnight. This systematic destruction of due process has created a shadow legal system where ATF bureaucrats wield more power than elected representatives. Constitutional scholars expose ATF lawlessness. Leading constitutional experts now argue that the ATF's entire regulatory framework violates multiple amendments and Supreme Court precedent. Recent court decisions apply strict scrutiny to Second Amendment cases, forcing government agencies to prove compelling interest and use the least restrictive means possible. Historical research reveals zero founding-era precedent for federal agencies taxing constitutional rights or requiring government permission to exercise enumerated freedoms. The ATF's arbitrary approval processes, where identical applications receive different treatment based on bureaucratic whims, violate due process and equal protection principles. Modern legal scholars point out that months-long approval delays constitute prior restraint on constitutional rights, which courts have repeatedly struck down in other contexts. Supreme Court precedent from recent landmark cases has fundamentally shifted the legal landscape against federal gun control agencies. Courts now require historical analogies from the founding era to justify any restrictions on Second Amendment rights, and no such precedent exists for the type of regulatory schemes the ATF has constructed. Constitutional law professors have published extensive research demonstrating that ATF operations violate the separation of powers by allowing executive agencies to create criminal law without legislative authorization. The agency's practice of issuing opinion letters that change legal interpretations without public notice violates administrative law principles. Federal appeals courts have increasingly struck down ATF regulations as unconstitutional overreach, creating circuit splits that virtually guarantee Supreme Court review of the agency's authority. Constitutional scholars argue that Trump's bill simply codifies what the courts will eventually rule anyway, making congressional action more efficient than waiting for litigation, economic destruction, and innovation suppression. The ATF's regulatory stranglehold has cost the American economy billions of dollars and thousands of jobs through artificial market restrictions and bureaucratic interference. Current regulations force manufacturers to design products around government approval processes instead of consumer needs and technological advancement, stifling innovation and competition. Small businesses that could create jobs and drive down prices are locked out of markets by ATF compliance costs that favor large corporations over entrepreneurs. The agency's approval bottlenecks prevent American companies from competing in international markets, handing business to foreign competitors who don't face similar regulatory obstacles. Industry analysts estimate that removing ATF barriers could create over 50,000 new manufacturing jobs within 2 years of deregulation. Companies currently spending millions on regulatory compliance could redirect those resources toward research, development, and expansion. The artificial scarcity created by ATF approval delays, drives up consumer prices while limiting product availability, essentially functioning as a hidden tax on constitutional rights. International trade data shows American manufacturers losing market share to countries with more reasonable regulatory frameworks, costing billions in export revenue annually. This economic sabotage serves no legitimate government purpose while enriching foreign manufacturers at the expense of American workers and innovation. ATF's bogus arguments completely destroyed. The ATF and their anti-gun allies are desperately spinning lies about public safety to protect their regulatory empire from Trump's constitutional wrecking ball. They claim federal oversight prevents crime, but their own statistics prove that legally regulated items are almost never used in criminal activity. We're talking single-digit cases annually out of millions of law-abiding owners. These same bureaucrats push Hollywood fiction about certain accessories, making firearms silent, when actual physics shows they remain louder than jackhammers, even with the best technology available. The ATF's traceability argument falls apart completely, since criminals use stolen weapons or illegal modifications, not items that require federal paperwork and background checks. Federal crime data consistently shows that ATF-regulated items represent less than 1% of weapons used in violent crimes, making their public safety arguments statistically meaningless. The agency admits that most of their investigative resources go toward prosecuting paperwork violations by law-abiding citizens, rather than preventing actual violent crime. International comparisons reveal that countries with fewer restrictions on these items have lower crime rates than the United States, destroying the correlation between regulation and safety. Their fear-based arguments rely on public ignorance about technical specifications rather than empirical evidence or constitutional principles. Political battle and your action required. The Senate parliamentarian now holds the power to either unleash constitutional freedom or protect ATF tyranny through procedural manipulation of budget reconciliation rules. Anti-gun Democrats are mobilizing every lobbying group, media outlet, and political ally to pressure her into killing Trump's provision before it reaches a floor vote. Republican leadership faces the ultimate test of their Second Amendment promises, as pro-gun constituents demand they follow through on decades of campaign rhetoric about restoring constitutional rights. The narrow reconciliation window makes this potentially the last chance for meaningful ATF reform during Trump's presidency. Every senator's vote will be recorded and remembered by millions of gun owners who are tired of broken promises and bureaucratic excuses for constitutional violations. This is your moment to contact senators and representatives with specific demands for ATF defunding and deregulation. Generic messages won't cut it when constitutional freedom hangs in the balance. Share this video immediately, because mainstream media is censoring coverage of how close we are to victory over federal gun control tyranny. The precedent set here determines whether future presidents can use federal agencies to violate constitutional rights, or whether Americans will finally restore the Second Amendment to its original meaning. The ATF's days of constitutional tyranny are numbered, but only if we act now, while Trump has the political power to destroy their regulatory empire forever. This is the moment Second Amendment warriors have been waiting for. Complete victory over federal gun control or another decade of bureaucratic oppression. Share this video right now with every gun owner, smash that subscribe button and hit notifications, because the mainstream media won't tell you when the ATF finally gets obliterated. Your constitutional rights depend on maximum pressure during the next few weeks, so get involved or watch freedom slip away again.